went to the G20 in London as there were two of us from Bristol went as volunteers working as legal observers with the Legal Defence Monitoring Group. Just to say a little bit about LDMG as it's known for short. LDMG was set up around 1994 as an activist project, and it effectively emerged out of an earlier project called the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign, which itself was set up in April 1990 after the poll tax demonstration on the 31st of March that year, which saw over 500 arrests. And TSDC, the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign, was set up to provide unconditional support to all those arrested. But more than that, TSDC also realised that there was a bit of a vacuum on the street during protests. There was no actual legal support on the street for protesters, certainly at the 31st of March poll tax demo. So on a subsequent poll tax demo in October 1990, which ended up in Brixton as a small riot, TSDC at that event put around 100 legal observers on the street to monitor the police behaviour at that protest, and also to try and gather information and provide support for the actual protesters on the day. And subsequently, the following day after the October poll tax demo, TSDC was able to provide a report on police behaviour that October, and was able to rebut the police's allegations that it was a preordained riot, and to show that the police behaviour that October was actually designed to create a riot. More importantly, they also, by having all those observers on the street that October, they were able to, within about 48 hours, have the names and details of everyone arrested, and therefore making it a lot easier to support them. Because after the poll tax demo in March 1990, when over 500 were arrested, initially there were hardly any names known to the support campaign, and it took 3 or 4 months for them to actually get the majority of details of those arrested, and only then could they really begin to provide support. So LDMG emerged out of TSDC basically in early 1994, and for a while LDMG was quite an organised activist project, and for the next 3 or 4 years they provided legal support and a backup office on quite a lot of radical protests, mainly in London. Since around 97-98, LDMG's been a lot more of an ad hoc group. It's sort of revived every time there's a major radical protest in London and occasionally elsewhere. So, for instance, it was present at J18 in 1999, the Carnival Against Capitalism. It was present on a couple of the other RTS actions in London. It was present at the May Day events in 2000 and early 2001, 2 and 3. And also LDMG was a driving force behind G8 legal support at Glen Eagles in 2005. But generally, LDMG is now an ad hoc group that when an event is happening, it will gather together volunteers who will help on the day. It will occasionally run an office, which is essentially a mobile phone somewhere, and it will provide the names of useful solicitors. Just to say a little bit about what LDMG is about. Basically, its aim is to provide unconditional support to anyone on a protest or arrested at a protest. So whether you're arrested for waving a fluffy duster under a riot cop's nose or for chucking a brick at that same riot cop, then LDMG will support you. We don't judge, we just support people who've been arrested and harassed by the state. LDMG never negotiates with the police. We don't pretend to speak for protesters. We're there to support the protest. We are part of the protest, but we don't negotiate with police. For instance, on June the 18th, 1999, the Carnival Against Capitalism, we had a young legal observer on the day who was also a trainee barrister, and at one point he, along with a few other legal observers and probably 500 or 600 protesters, were stuck on a bridge somewhere in the, over the Thames, corralled in with riot police at each end. Now, I don't know if this young trainee barrister saw his career disappearing over the horizon, or was concerned that the riot police might be about to chuck us all into the river. But wearing his legal observer bib, he then went up and tried to negotiate with the police to be allowed off the bridge. So that was not acceptable, and he had his bib removed and he was stood down as a legal observer on the day. That's an example. Moving back swiftly now to the 1st of April, there were two actual legal teams on the 1st of April. There was LDMG covering the G20 meltdown protests, which was around the Bank of England. There was also the climate camp, which was a 10 to 15 minute walk away up in Bishopsgate. They had their own legal team, and the two legal teams operated independently, separately if you like. That doesn't mean that they were in conflict, but they were essentially covering two different areas. As it happened, the climate camp, at least in the afternoon on the 1st of April, was very quiet. Once they'd, quiet in terms of police harassment, once they'd been able to occupy the street that they obviously wanted to target, they had a fairly relatively easy time until the evening. So some of the climate camp legal observers did come down to the Bank of England to give us a little bit of support, and we spoke to a couple of them there. Interestingly, one of them introduced himself to us as a Liberal Democrat MP, but I didn't quite catch his name. The role of LDMG, the legal observers on the day, there were 12 of us, which, to be honest, is nothing like enough. We work in teams of 2 or 3 individuals. Our role on the day is to hand out bus cards, which are like small bits of card or bits of paper that carry basic legal information about your rights on the street, things around stop and search, what to do if you're arrested, a website and email for LDMG, also a solicitor's phone number for a solicitor, firm of solicitors who we'd arranged to be on call. So ideally we'd try and hand those out to as many people as possible, introduce ourselves to people, make it clear that we're there to support them because we are part of the protest. We are not legal experts. I don't necessarily know any more about the law than any of you do. Our role is not to argue the law. Our role effectively is there to support the protesters and monitor the police. The second thing we do is that we try and gather information and witness evidence on anyone who's arrested, which is often more difficult than it sounds because when people get arrested, things tend to be moving quite fast, but we do that to the best of our ability. The third thing we do is we try and monitor the actual police behaviour. So like when the riot cops come in, when the batons get drawn, maybe when they send the horses into a crowd. If we see police officers without their ID, so on and so on, particular behaviour of the police. But we watch the police. The only time we watch the demonstrators is when they're being arrested, and then we try and get information that will help them. We also try and talk to protesters as we hand out the bus cards, but also as we observe the police actions, because we're not watching other protesters as much. We're there to watch the police, really, see what they're doing. We often see what the police are doing before other people, so sometimes we're able to advise people that there's about to be a riot charge coming right up behind them. On the day, on the 1st of April, the 12 LOs from legal observers from LDMG, we were on the street from about 11:30 until about 7 o'clock at night, which means we weren't around when Mr. Tomlinson was pushed over and subsequently died. That has been a long-standing LDMG policy that they stand down their legal observers at around dusk. The basic reasons for that are that it's a lot more dangerous, well, for us, for everyone, once it gets dark, and it's a lot harder to coordinate our work, and it's a lot harder to actually see what the police are doing. So we had effectively stood down and gone off for a debrief around 7 o'clock. So we no longer acted as legal observers after that time. We work in groups of 2 or 3. We might be given a pre-allocated area or part of the protest to monitor. The 2 people I was with, we were sent to go and monitor what was called the green section. There were 4 sections for the G20 meltdown march. Can't remember all their colours. I think it was green, black, silver and one other. The green one met at Liverpool Street, and we were asked to stay with that march up to the bank, and then when we arrived at the bank, the 3 of us were asked to adopt a bit of a roving role and staying outside of any police cattle or cordons and moving around outside looking for trouble that may be happening and to keep an eye on what the police were doing. And the reason that we try and stay in groups of 2 or 3 is partly for our own health and safety, to keep an eye out for each other. But also, as you can imagine, it's quite hard writing down, making notes, particularly when you get older like me and you have to wear glasses and you have to move quite quickly. So often one person will get quite close into whatever may be happening and will then come back and give a quick report to someone else who will write down the details. So for instance, we would aim, if someone's being arrested, one of us would aim to be very close to that arrest, which sometimes helps dissuade the police from being less, well, hopefully makes them less violent when they conduct the arrest. We'll try and be quite close if they're pushing a crowd back or fighting with a crowd. And we'll generally try and be there where it's unpleasant so that we can see what's happening and we can see who's being arrested and try and get the names of people being arrested. It's a sort of accepted thing that if you get arrested, that you shout your name out, either to your mates who can tell it to us or hopefully we'll catch it ourselves. A couple of things about legal observers, where they come from. As I've said, it is an activist project. We are activists. We support the protests. We would otherwise be in the protest, but we've chosen to take on a particular support role. Legal observers tend to come from 2 or 3 sort of areas. You get slightly older people like myself, who perhaps don't think we can quite keep up with the youth anymore. So we can have a slightly slower role, but still being where it's quite interesting. We get some younger activists who may be studying some form of law, who I wouldn't say they see it as an addition to their studies, but I guess it gives them an experience of the sharp end. And we also sometimes we have activists, particularly in London, who perhaps are very well known to the police and are likely to be followed by the guys in blue that you saw, the forward intelligence teams. And some of these activists take the view that they can't actually do any protesting because they're always surrounded by the fit officers. So they opt to work for LDMG for the day and try and do something useful. Now, obviously, I took notes on the day, not that many, because I was sort of the one who was trying to see what was happening and pass the information on to my partner. But I've written a few notes down, just a snapshot of what us 2 or 3 did on the day, and it just covers a few basics. So we started off at 11:30. 3 of us went to Liverpool Street Station, where the Green Horseman of the Apocalypse and his process were forming up. At Liverpool Street, there's more than one exit from Liverpool Street Station. So people were coming out onto the main street, which I forget the name of it, but also the side of Liverpool Street Station where the road is actually called Liverpool Street. So we handed out bus cards. There was quite a heavy police presence, but not unbelievably heavy. After being at the front, we went round to the side. And while we were around the side, the police suddenly kettled in, like protesters forming up at the side of Liverpool Street Station. We saw this coming. We stepped like outside of that cordon. And to be honest, we thought that might be it at that point. We thought, okay, they've kettled them. They're not going to let them through. We could be staying here for a few hours until such time as it disperses. There was no announcement. There was no loudspeaker announcement by the police. At no time, certainly then, did we hear that there was a Section 60 in place, which allows them to stop and search people, or a Section 14, or anything else. They just formed up several lines, and they corralled everyone in outside Liverpool Street. And they didn't just corral in protesters. There were lots of people in their lunch breaks or going to and from, in and out of the station, who were caught in these police lines, and basically, that's it, you're there. They won't let you through. They won't, as far as they're concerned, everyone's the same, whether you're, just a shop worker or a shopper or whatever. A few people did try and get out. We saw one older guy who asked to be let through, who was, I'm guessing, was a protester. He was pushing a bike, and he was told no. He went to walk through. He was pushed backwards over his bike, landed on the floor. He could have been another Ian Tomlinson. He could have smacked the back of his head on the concrete. Luckily, he didn't. However, the police didn't corral it in. I think in retrospect, it turns out that what they wanted to do, they wanted to control the Green Group's march to the bank, which was obviously the ultimate meet-up point for the G20 protests, and the 4 groups went there. In fact, there were 5 groups because they split the Green. The people on the side went one way, and the ones at the main entrance to Liverpool Street were taking another one. And the green group then, our half of it moved off. It had quite a tight police cordon around it. It had a sort of a line of cops at the front who were basically walking backwards for about 1.5 miles all the way to Bank. And behind this line of cops at the front, there were probably around 150 photographers, which it made it quite a confusing, interesting situation. And I guess the cops just wanted to make sure that people went to the bank and didn't try and go anywhere else. And they certainly achieved that. And by around 12:30, our group was outside the bank. And slowly the other 4 marches all met up outside the bank. So outside the bank, the legal observers basically spread around. We were watching the police cordons. Once all the marchers got there, the cordons were closed, the kettle was complete, as they say. There was no particular announcement. You could see it coming, or we could see it coming. It was quite easy to see it coming. But it was just suddenly it was shut off. If you were inside the police line, you were inside. You weren't allowed out. You weren't particularly told why. You weren't told how long you'd have to wait. You were just there. And that included protesters, and it included quite a lot of people. So anyway, we stepped outside those police lines, and we were basically started to wander around the edges of the cordon, which you could do. They kept putting new cordons in like funny little side streets and stuff. But you could get your way around, and you can find some weak spots in their lines as well, which means that don't walk up to a really big TSG officer. Try to, like some of the older police who aren't particularly right trained, like your normal Bobby, if you like, they're more likely to be polite if you're polite, and then you can just like slip through their lines a little bit easier. So we wandered around, and we ended up back on Threadneedle Street, ironically outside the Royal Bank of Scotland. And there was, at that point, there was a push, the 4 horses, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which were bits of material on a couple of sticks, had decided that they wanted to try and get out of Threadneedle Street outside the bank, and they were trying to push up east, which was in the direction of the climate camp, although it was, like I said, about a 15-minute walk away. This push didn't get very far. Although it didn't have a huge amount of police like in front of it. You saw some of the footage, some of the sort of fairly nasty footage there, around 1 to 1:30, I guess, when you had a line of yellow-jacketed police, not riot cops, like basically blocking off this push to try and get out of the kettle. And there was some quite serious pushing and shoving. We were behind that line of police. There was some serious pushing and shoving. There was some hand-to-hand fighting. There was a lot of police battening going in over the top with their extendable metal batons. You saw some of the head injuries on the protesters, which is what you're going to get if you get hit by an extended metal baton on the top of your head, or indeed anywhere. But at the front, they're hitting down over the top. Protesters, from what we could see, were trying to defend themselves and push out. Because the police had formed this line, behind this line where we were, there were other protesters sort of either arriving late or interested bystanders in their lunch hour, press, whatever. So after a fairly short period of time, the police had to sort of put another line of yellow-jacketed officers facing those of us behind the first line. So in a way you had a crowd, a line of police, then another line of police, and then sort of another crowd, which was an indication of poor policing, really. They've left themselves open. In effect, you had almost a police sandwich. They should probably have closed the road further off and stopped people getting behind their line, but they didn't, and this caused them a subsequent problem. The fighting of protesters trying to push out Threadneedle Street was getting worse, and eventually, I think you might have seen the footage, the yellow-jacketed police line was actually rolled to one side. It was pushed to one side, and the 2 lines which were across sort of folded up against one side. And for a brief moment, it looked as if, or there was a possibility that protesters could push out of that kettle. Unfortunately, as often happens, people step back to admire their handiwork, and the next thing they knew, you had the riot police charging in. And they only really got about as far as about another 20 metres up to the junction where you saw the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is the junction of Threadneedle Street and Bartholomew Lane. As you know, the Royal Bank of Scotland subsequently had a few windows broken. We were sort of behind the new police line. We went round the back into the bottom of Bartholomew Street. And at the top of it, obviously, there were a few people breaking the window, and there were a lot of police taking photos of it. But at the bottom of Bartholomew Street, which I don't think we've seen any footage of, there was now a line of riot police on horseback, about 20 forward intelligence officers, and they were quickly bringing in their TSG units for the bottom of that street. So it was a matter of time before they were going to push up Bartholomew to where people were saying hi to the Royal Bank of Scotland. There was a very amusing incident here. One of the four horses, a bit of material on a couple of sticks, was like halfway down this lane, waving its sort of horse-like nose at the riot police on horseback. And very interestingly, the riot police horses didn't like this strange figure and started to almost rear up on them. A couple of them reared up on their back legs. For the forward intelligence, this was far too much. So a small squad of about 6 forward intelligence ran out. Didn't arrest anyone, they just grabbed this fake horse and smashed it to bits. And the 2 people holding it, I guess, retreated fairly quickly, thanking that they hadn't been arrested. They then charged up, obviously up Bartholomew Lane to stop the smashing of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we got out of the way fairly sharpish. For the next hour, we were sort of wandering around again the outside of the police cordons. Around 4 o'clock, we ended up roughly slightly to the west of the Bank of England, more or less at the junction of Threadneedle Street, Cheapside, Cornhill, and Prince Street, I think it was. And for some reason there, suddenly people managed to push through the police cordon without any opposition, going down Queen Victoria Street. And we're not quite clear why that was allowed, but you had suddenly a large crowd of people, this is going west now, walking down Queen Victoria Street. And they were basically walked unhindered for perhaps half a mile until they got down to a junction basically with Cannon Street. And then the police obviously regrouped, sent people around the side, and they put up another thick line of riot police and stopped people. I mean, I think most of those people would probably have left if they'd been allowed to exit. They'd been in the police kettle for 3 to 4 hours at that point. But obviously a lot of them were stopped. But again, you had this line of riot police like stopping the majority of this crowd that had been trying to leave, break out, whatever. But behind this police line, you had like other protesters and bystanders. And then you had more police lines forming up around side streets. But again, often with you had a police line and protesters behind it and in front of it. And I think at that point, it seemed to us that the police would perhaps run out of the heavy mob, the TSG, the Territorial Support Group, who have a U on their numbers. And we're in fact using slightly less riot-trained officers. Riot training comes in 3 levels. Level 3 is basically your hardcore big lads, TSG. Level 2 is your normal bobby who's had a fair bit of riot training, but they don't have to be particularly big or indeed male. They come in all shapes and sizes, and some of them may be your local community bobby at other times. And there is this fundamental difference. This lot aren't as well trained. They are scared. They're quite scared because they're often surrounded by a large group of angry protesters. And you can see that they don't really know what to do or where to go or how to support each other, which does offer protesters seeking to move on opportunities. We hung around this area of Queen Victoria Street and Cannon Street junction there for about an hour. Some people broke away and went off down Cannon Street. Some people slept through the lines and I don't know where they went. And then the police decided that they were going to push the majority of the crowd back up Queen Victoria Street, back towards the Bank of England. So a couple of us went round some sides because we couldn't get through the police line. The right line was in about 3 deep. We went round the side and up a couple of side streets and over a wall or two and jumped back sort of into where the crowd was being pushed back. And if you've seen, I think you might have seen the climate camp being cleared where you saw lines of riot police pushing into the climate camp. using the shields at an angle and the batons over the top. And this was pretty much the same on Queen Victoria Street. So you had 3 thick lines of riot crews across a very wide road, probably 50 metres wide, like just basically pushing quite consistently with their shields and with their batons, quite a thick crowd back for about half an hour. And to be quite honest, that was probably the most violent section of the day that I saw. It was quite unpleasant. A lot of people were hurt. A lot of people were being pushed over backwards because the riot police would just they would push them for like 10 metres and stop, then push them for another 10 metres and stop. And a lot of people were getting hurt at that point. Eventually they pushed everyone back up, and then they had their kettle back on again. And we basically hung around then for another hour or so until it started to get dusk. Footage of a social centre, I think in somewhere else in East London, which initially was quite calm and quite small. There weren't that many people. As the day went on, more people turned up, and eventually that was cordoned in too. Again, there was no announcement to advise people that they could no longer leave. The cordon appeared, and that was it. You were either inside it or you were outside it. You saw a section of one of the senior police officers talking to press and telling them to clear the area. That happened on the 2nd of April. And basically they essentially isolated the people outside the Bank of England, and they cleared everyone else back at least a quarter of a mile. In some ways that was like quite scary for the protesters who were there to commemorate Tomlinson's death, because no one could see them. There were no press. In the event nothing particular happened, they were eventually let out. Many of them, as usual, were searched under Section 60. Quite a lot, as usual, were pressured into giving their name and address when they don't have to. Some who refused to give their name and address were then told that various other sections were in place. So there is a need for people to know their law a bit more and to stand up for themselves a little bit more. I mean, just as a few closing comments from my experience over the last, over quite a few years. I mean, the police tactics on these events are now quite predictable. If they know that, like, the protest is looking to go from here to there to do a fairly antagonistic protest, then it seems likely that they will generally allow that protest to go from A to its end place, and once it reaches its end, they will then contain it within a specified geographical area, and they won't let people out. They might let them in for a while, they'll let more people in for a bit, but they won't let you out. So I didn't particularly find the police that violent, to be honest. There's been a lot of hoo-ha about the violence by the police. To be honest, if you look back at major protests over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been a lot worse. People who were here perhaps a couple of weeks ago and saw the poll tax film would have seen a lot worse behaviour by the police, driving vans at speed into packed crowds, charging riot horses in large groups into packed crowds. Generally a lot more indiscriminate beating than there actually was at the G20. I didn't think it was that over the top. It's unpleasant. The police break the law, they lose their temper, they lose the rag. A lot of them are quite scared. They don't know what's going on. Their command structure breaks down. When you've got 5 or 6 different forces there, there is a degree of conflict sometimes between their different officers. They're not infallible. They're also not unbeatable, but the crowd needs to be prepared, or protesters need to be prepared. If they're going to try and evade the police, they need to think about it more before they turn up. What I would say is that in an instance like this, where you had 2 clearly confrontational protests, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but if you're going to organise confrontational protests, if you're going to say, we're going to storm the banks, we're going to make the bankers pay, we're going to squat outside the carbon trading office, and we're going to stop capitalism, even if just for a short period of time. If you're going to take on capital and the state, then don't be surprised if they react violently, because they will do. Whether protesters are violent or not, if you seriously challenge their authority, their ability to make money, then they're going to stop you, and they're going to use anything they can do to stop you. Whether you're peaceful, like the climate campers, or not so peaceful as some of the people outside the bank may have been. that is the response that will happen. So if we're going to call protests that are clearly confrontational protests, as they should be, because we live in a confrontational society, then we have to be prepared for the reaction from the state. And we actually need to be a lot more prepared. We're very poor at legal support and supporting fellow protesters after events. A lot of people get arrested and don't get support. People don't know their details, so we're not able to support them. People have got to be a lot better at looking out for each other, about forming themselves into small groups where everyone knows each other and can pass details on to other support networks. So we need to wise up a little bit if we're going to do things like this again, because otherwise there will be yet more people arrested and a lot more people badly injured. And arguably one wonders what exactly has been achieved. That's what I've got to say today. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Tim. Does anyone have a question they want to fire off to before we have our next speaker?
This whole thing about stopping at dusk, I can understand the practicality of that, but I was out on the streets after dusk, and that's when all the worst stuff happened. And it was very, very violent after dusk. And where I was, it would have been really good if there would have been some legal support. There was also the time when all the cameras disappeared, because probably people can't take pictures in that sort of conditions. But there was all kinds of stuff going on where there was no comeback at all. So, I take your point. You go out and you expect that to happen, but I'm just sort of saying, is there no way that legal support can be provided in such conditions?
I think that may be, that condition may be reviewed, but that's been the long-standing situation with LDMG. There was obviously it was disappointing that legal observers weren't around later on, but it is very hard to do legal support once it gets dark. And I think LDMG feels that it has a degree of responsibility to the people who volunteer on the day, not to leave them exposed. We, as legal observers, one of the things we can't do is we can't enter into, say, physical conflict with the cops. We don't really talk to them that much. They know what we are, but we're not really in a position to defend ourselves. And once it gets off dark, then the need to defend yourself gets a lot greater, and a lot less is seen. So, it's unfortunate. Maybe if we had significantly more people who were prepared to be legal observers, it might be a little bit easier. But again, when there's very few of us, it leaves it in a very tricky situation.
Okay. I'm going to ask then Will, unless anybody else want to fire anything quickly, if you want to come up and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll just say a few very little things. Yeah. So I met Tim outside the Bank of England on the Thursday. Just a couple of thoughts to add to what he said. I mean, I've been at protest demos right back to the 70s, and a lot of the quite nasty ones like Wapping, and I would agree with what Tim was saying that I think there was a lot of brutality. That was my impression up at the G20, and I wasn't there on the Wednesday, but talking to people, and clearly the police had been pretty brutal, and you can see from the film that they were. But as Tim said, I mean, if you look back at Wapping, they were awful, just shocking, really, and there's been Battle of Beanfield, numerous examples over the last 20 years. I'm sure you all know that police have been pretty brutal, or very brutal on occasions. So that's right. What was a real shocker this time, I had to pinch myself, was I've never seen the media so hostile. That was a real big change. I mean, I've been to things like, involved the miners' strike at Wapping, when you knew the police were being incredibly brutal, but then you'd read the papers and there would be just massive support for them and no criticism at all. And that was to me, I don't know if Tim felt this or other people felt this, but to me the real significance of the G20 was I was picking up the Daily. Well, I wasn't actually picking up the Daily Express. I was looking at the Daily Express on the newsstands, and it was like, police batter our lovely girls, and it was just that is a big change to me, and I thought that was dead interesting. And part of it, obviously, the police were part of it was the death of Ian Tomlinson, which was clearly something. Part of it was the fact that people had their mobiles were filming, which was significant. But I think it's a real watershed, and I think it's probably because there is just like a real crisis in the world order. Really, that's what I think. That's why I think it is. I think the to use the jargon, I think the ruling class is like really in a state of confusion, and I think the police are very uncertain, and the sort of political control of the media has slipped. That's why I think it is. But I don't know what. I would be interested to hear other people's comments on that, because to me it was extremely striking, the difference in the media coverage of the police behaviour at G20 compared to previous events that I've been to. So I think that's all. The other thing I would just say, I just think the protesters are fantastic. I just got to say, I just think people are ever so brave. I think people are ever so brave. I don't really agree with Tim. I think people will get hurt in the future. I think people will get arrested. I think people are pretty well organised generally. I thought climate camp for the past 2 years, exceptionally well organised. A lot of them got bloody smashed to pieces up at G20. That wasn't because they weren't well organised, it's just because the police were incredibly fucking brutal, to be honest. So, great on what... I think what Tim does, the legal observer, is absolutely fantastic and very important, and definitely keeps some control over what the police do, and definitely minimises the amount of police violence. But no, I think I just thought it was very interesting and very heartening. I just got to say, I thought that the courage and tenacious determination of the protesters was just incredibly heartening, really. And I thought on the Thursday, I thought the police looked shocked, and I thought the protesters looked shocked. It was like sort of, it was just a bit of a strange and bitter standoff, really. I think that's... the only other thing I would say, City of London, very sensitive target. That's the other thing I would say about it, is that the IRA showed this, and the provisional IRA, during their campaign, they switched targeting to the City of London, and it really, really made the ruling class of this country twitchy, and is a real Achilles heel for them. And that was the other thing going on during the G20, is like it's the City of London is a major Achilles heel and a big disruption in the City of London. They get extremely twitchy about it, and I think that's the other factor that was significant.
Well, just to fire off a question and take moderator's prerogative. As you've been involved in some of the climate camp, I'm interested, do you think there seems to me from reading the news a bit of a campaign against climate protesters. You've had the unauthorised spying on passing of information to a private company, which I understand is technically illegal. You've had the civil servants getting involved with private energy companies to help. You've had the trying to recruit informants offering up to £10,000 apparently, and then the preemptive arrests of people going on protests. Is this just, again, we're more aware of it, or is do they have it in for climate protesters?
So personally, I think the climate camp is a real headache, because I think they're very well organised. They've got together a very well organised and effective strategy of non-violent direct action that the police really struggle to deal with. That's my opinion, and I think they would. And I was talking to a kiddie who'd got his arm broken. He was at climate camp up in G20 when the police smashed it up, and they'd clearly gone in and given him a real kicking, and they'd broken this kid's arm, and and it was like the climate camp are a real problem for them, because they're sort of determinedly non-violent, but they're also incredibly out for direct action and screwing the police about, and the police, they do not like it at all, and I think it sort of, and I thought, the last climate camp where they had their flotilla and all of that stuff, and they got quite interesting headlines and quite interesting media stuff, and because the police are very big on controlling the media agenda, and the police make a real effort to control how it's all reported. So I think climate camp's a real headache for them, and they would really like to see it screwed up, I'm just going to it is a big and funny game, isn't it? Like the guy said, I thought it was a telling point where a million people protested against the Iraq war, and it made no difference because there was no trouble, yeah. and so you're right, all happened anyway. So the whole issue, it is a game over public order and over protest, isn't it? Yeah, it's just an interesting thing, but very encouraging that the police got some real stick for this, and it'll make them. I mean, if there's another big demo where there might be trouble, I really recommend you go on it, because the police are going to be very much more nervous on the next one, and it'll be much more interesting. You know, it'll be like you'll really be able to push them, and they'll be like a lot more wary about pushing people over for a start.
Anybody else want to add or ask questions?
When is that demo that you were saying?
No, I'm just saying when there will be a next one at some point. Yeah.
Well, in fact, on UK Indie Media, you can see the little headline down the bottom there: the police told to behave at Smash EDO May Day. So if you go to indiemedia.org.uk, there is an article at a protest since that, which will be interesting to see the policing that happened there. So
I just wanted to add that there's no footage about what happened at the end of the climate camp. I was at the climate camp all day, and it was very peaceful, as everyone said everything. And about 1 a.m. in the morning, a lot of people were still there with the tents and everything, and we were all peaceful. And from 7 p.m. they started doing the kettling around, so nobody could leave, nobody could get in. And as you said, the climate camp was very organized. We had toilet there, we had people giving food for free, and all these things, so that was very good. And at 12, as I said, in the night, there's no footage of this. They're starting pushing from one street with lots and lots of police, just got rid of us in one push and beating people. And my boyfriend got his wrist broken as well by falling many times on the floor. Just to say it's a shame that nobody's got footage of this, and that
Your boyfriend's not the phantom chalker.
yeah.
I was talking to you on the Thursday. Yeah, cool, yeah.
Well, his wrist is better now,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
you can get cameras with low visibility settings now.
probably,
Maybe
yeah.
we need to
I
see
didn't
some
find
info.
any videos of that moment. And then as we couldn't stay there, it was very scary. The police was very scary, and we managed to grab our tent, even if they were crunched up. My tent was broken, and we joined the squad, which has been raided the next day, and we slept there. It was very handy. Yeah, that's all.
Any more want to add? Yourself and then gentlemen.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the things why the climate camp is so effective is that there is a lot of imagination used in how climate camp has been opposing things. There's a lot of humour being used, and there's a lot of inventiveness being used, and I think that is extremely effective in these sort of situations. It doesn't mean to say you don't get beaten up, because it does happen, but I still think it's much more challenging to the police and to the authorities in general to see that kind of stuff. It's much more subversive to what the authorities are trying to do against us, to actually use our imaginations and to be very inventive like that. I think we could do more of that. And the other thing I think I saw actually at the G20 was that on the few occasions when people really worked together, you could break out of the kettle. It was possible to do those things, but it actually required people to have thought it through and got themselves organised so that they could do it. And I think we need to do more of that as well. We need to be thinking through the predictable thing that happened to us, which was we got kettled in, and we need to be prepared to make the efforts to get out, and then to think what you're going to do when you get out.
Yeah, kind of cheering from that point really. Will, on the one hand, is saying at the next protest, be present, because the police, there's movement there, and then on the other side I would say opposite, because it's coming from the same standpoint, but Tim's saying be careful, because there isn't enough thought about what happens when you get caught by the police and the control that police can put in place. So maybe there needs to be more communication about tactics against the way that the police are going to handle the situation, because they've got their set way of doing things, and there needs to be learning. So when we are faced with that same challenge, to get through it and get good results from the protests.
Yeah, I was at the G20 on the Wednesday and just want to pick up on a couple of points what other people have said really. One thing I think we've got to remember is why we were all there. There's the stuff about the climate change, there's the stuff protests against the G20, there's the whole thing about the banking system and, you know, the way that the government's failed everybody. And I think a lot of this has created a situation where people have forgotten to protest about that stuff and it's all about the police. So the anger got turned. It was anger against the bankers, anger against the city, and anger against the recession and all that got turned, you know, towards anger against the police. And so we've got to remember that, and you know, I hope there are more demonstrations. There's a demonstration in Birmingham on the 16th about jobs, and we need to be there. The attitude of the police got me on the Wednesday, and I went to the memorial service for Ian Tomlinson the following week, and the difference with the police attitude, and I know what you're saying, Will, about by the Thursday they were a lot more subdued. On the Wednesday they were totally fucking arrogant, you know, and I was asking police, where's your number, what's your number, and they're just going, under the jacket, you know, they just didn't care at all. And so I did the thing of writing down the number of the person next to them and reported them for all that. We were kettled in. I was there with my kids and we were kettled in for hours and hours, and I kept saying, I want to leave, I want to take my kids out, and they just said they shouldn't be here, they should be at school, you know, and just really cocky attitudes. But by the Thursday they're a bit more subdued. The memorial for Ian Tomlinson was just unbelievable. You saw a bit on the footage that they were really, really quiet, and you know, and the attitude had changed. But I agree with Will that we shouldn't expect any different, you know. All through the last few decades, the police have repressed us because they are there to protect the state, and they are there to protect any kind of protest that is going to challenge, you know, the state machine. So they'll smash pickets at Grunwick or Wapping. They'll smash the miners' strike. I was at Lewisham, and they'll smash demonstrators who are opposing the National Front, you know, and all these things will keep coming around, and it's up to us to fight back. I would agree with what you said about, you know, that there wasn't that. You probably could have broken through the kettle, but there wasn't that feeling of that impetus that people had. Maybe it's a lack of confidence because it's not happened for a long time. But then just the last thing I would say, that I think all of this has come out because of the new technologies, you know, the amount of videos that just were blasted out there on Facebook, on Indie Media, on, you know, The Guardian getting all the stuff. It's immediately out there, you know, and all this crap about you can't photograph the police. I've now taken it on as a hobby to photograph police, you know, and post them up on Facebook. And I think we've all just got to keep doing that. We've just got to keep up the fight and keep up being protesters, you know.
Indie media is ever so valuable, isn't it? You've got to say that, and when something like this happens, it like just shows how important indie media is, and the other things. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's just been said there. I was going to say a lot of that stuff actually, but I think it is really important to put it in context. And like a lot of our discussion tonight has kind of fallen into the trap that the media did as well, as focusing on the confrontation and the big spectacular sexy demos, and a lot of the issues get eclipsed. And I think it's good to kind of remind ourselves as to why we're there, and that's for a lot of different reasons, but kind of against a massively class entrenched system which is just laying the planet to waste and people's lives to waste. On the subject of preparedness for demos, I'd agree with what Tim was saying, that a lot of people, I think, go to demos, and I appreciate there's a lot of new people that go to demos, and maybe there just needs to be a bit more sort of passing on of information from old hands, or kind of a bit of reading of history, because history will show that the police are routinely violent, that you can't reform the police, you can't see it in terms of a few bad apples. It's systematic violence all the way. Police violence and brutality is as old as the police itself. Ask any people of colour, ask any people living in poverty, ask anyone who's living kind of life in defiance, really. They'll say that, yeah, police batons are pretty standard. So it's about preparing yourself for demos, knowing a bit about the law, studying police tactics and treating it seriously, because if we're serious about lasting radical change, they're going to get seriously opposed to us, as we see. It's nothing new.
Well, what I'm going to suggest we do now, we had a couple more films show, it's getting on to about 10 now, but I think at least one of them is worth showing, which is a 7-minute film about some factory occupations that's been happening in Dundee, which goes back to the point that the last two commentators have really helpfully raised, which is actually not forgetting that there is an underlying issue that was being protested here. And I think it's important that there are these very important struggles going on where people are losing their jobs, but they're not just taking it, they're deciding to do something about it. And in actual fact, we've got, unfortunately we don't have the time to show it all, but we'll put links on Bristol Indie Media where you can get more about it. But there's 45 minutes in total of films of factory occupations happening all around. But I think it's at least going to be good to get a flavour of it, that these things are happening and people are resisting it in more ways than just simply protesting. So I just waved to my colleague to do the video. We'll just start this.
You know, because I feel that the economic the economic strategy that's been run in the world for the last 30 years has collapsed spectacularly. I think we're in a historically new moment of global recession, and for the first time with a world economy. And so G20, and with Obama in the States, G20 was the first time to see whether what was going to replace Thatcher and Reagan, basically. That was what was interesting about it. And I think the issues are, I mean, you know, as you know, the world crisis is still rolling on. We've had a period of slight stabilisation in the last month. Obama's struggling in the States, but is sort of doing okay so far. The American car industry is in the moment of being being restructured at the moment, which is terribly important. I mean, it's all still really going on, and that against the background of climate change and peak oil. So, you know, I mean, we couldn't be living through a more historic moment, it seems to me. And I just felt for G20, the eyes of the world was on it, and you know, everybody like us in the world would be looking at it and hoping we'd get up there and you know, give them a shout for them, really. So yeah, I mean, you know as well as I do. I'm sure all of the politics of it, but that's the. So I'd just be dead interested to see what happens in the next 6 months. But I would say, I mean, there's no doubt at all, unemployment's headed for 3.5 million in this country by this time next year, and I mean, what you've just seen is going to be the future for us, and it's going to be very rough. And you know, so it is going to be very interesting. That's the main thing I can say. It will be interesting, you know.
Anybody else want to come in and make a brief comment before we finish? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. A bit of round of applause to our two speakers and everything like that.